Hi, David Vizard here, and you guys are watching PowerTec 10. In this edition, now to go by somewhere up here, we're going to take a big leap into airflow properties that an engine best responds to. Now, I'm putting this in the 5 golden rules of porting, and I'm not sure which category this falls into, but basically it's getting air through the engine. Now I want to start off with an introduction here which will lead into what I'm saying. My primary goal here is to look at a factor which is so overlooked, reversion, and how it affects the engine, and more to the point, how you can minimize it. Little tricks which at the end of the day add up to a much better power curve. Not always more horsepower, but always more torque in the ranges where it's weakest. So let's get to it. This is the introduction from my 2-day class on engine development. So here we go. Now I'm probably speaking for 95% of our viewers here, but I would hazard a guess that your goal, whether you realize it or not, is to get the maximum output of your engine for the application you intend to use it for. That ranges from everything from just a regular street towing vehicle to an all-out race vehicle. We're dealing with a whole pile of parts here, each of which needs to be optimum for the job it's intended to do. So just read this screen carefully here. Let me introduce you to my power output box. This is what I feel is a simple way to demonstrate all the areas we need to improve. First, we are subject to atmospheric conditions, so that's our starting point. From there, you can see the induction system goes through various stages, as you can follow the arrows around, down to another box labeled the long block assembly. Now, basically I'm considering pushrod engines here with a cam in the block, but you can relate that also to overhead cam engines. Now, to get the best results out of this, we've got to optimize all those groups. And here's where we go to look at the system as a whole. The point is, we've got to find out what the major obstruction is in the system first and work on it from there. So that's exactly what we're showing here. So where's the point of greatest restriction in our overall system in the search for output? It's not in the intake system or the intake port. It is not in the exhaust. It is right at the intake valve. The output of your engine depends almost solely, assuming everything else is okay, on how well air can get by the intake valve. Doing a quick summary, the function of the intake valve is to let as much air pass through it into the cylinder. But there's a secondary thing here. The definition of a valve is something which allows something to go one way but not the other. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that during the delayed closing of the intake valve, the piston's coming up the bore. So there's a propensity for whatever was drawn in to be pushed back out again. We don't want that. We want a valve which, when it's open, flows well going in, but not very well for the air to reverse and go out. That goal is better achieved by making sure that we deal with what we call reversion, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Yes, I know I said in that little intro there, starting at the valve, but in truth, taking care of anti-reversion, which means encouraging the gases to flow through the engine unidirectional, i.e. from the intake atmosphere to where it goes out the exhaust, actually starts at the ram stack on the intake. Port diameter is a critical factor here. You can appreciate that the bigger the port gets, the slower the gas velocity is, and the smaller it gets, the higher it is. It is harder to reverse flow with a small intake port. Now, I'm going to quote Darren Morgan here, and if you don't know who Darren Morgan is, you should just check it up on YouTube. He's a fellow head porter of great repute. And in one of his videos, he said there's 3 things that you need to take care of with heads. Very important. And that's 1, velocity. 2, velocity. And I know you're going to guess what the third one is. 3, velocity. And let me tell you, that's about 99.9% right. Now, I'm going to bypass that because I want to talk about induction separately. So I'm going to start at the valve. Now, can you see this okay? This valve has a groove in it around here. I'm going to show a still picture of it so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, when the air is going in, this side of the valve, the form of this side, is the critical side. However, once it's gone past the intake valve, then there comes a time where we run into the overlap period, and depending on how much the overlap is, there will be a tendency at lower RPM for the exhaust to want to flow out, because the piston could be coming up the bore at the end of the stroke and blowing out intake charge that had previously drawn in, because the port velocity at lower RPM is less. So if we make the exhaust valve have a poor discharge coefficient going out and a good one coming in, then we will have what I would call a secondary valving event. The valve itself acts as a poor second valve, i.e. it allows air into the cylinder, but it doesn't allow it out very easy. Now, in a perfect world, we'd have a valve which allowed air in, but absolutely forbade it any chance of getting back out again. Well, that's not possible the way we're doing things. That's why you have variable valve timing. At low RPM, when the port velocity is low, you can close the valve sooner in the cycle so that reversion does not occur. Our small block Chevys aren't equipped with anything like that, although they could be equipped with variable valve timing that advanced and retarded the cam. That's not very hard to do. Just need somebody to give me a phone call and I'll tell you how it's done. Let's go on here. This groove is our first step toward anti-reversion. The essence is that most intake valves work better as an exhaust than they do an intake. In other words, if you were to flow an intake port backwards, you would find it would flow better in the lower lift ranges than it does when it's flowed in the right direction. That's not good. That is absolutely defeating what we're trying to do here. So the first deal is make this groove. Shows how it's done in my book on cylinder heads, right? One of the many things it shows that other books don't. So that's the first thing. How good is it? Well, let me tell you a story here. Way back in my mini racing days, that's when I was racing a British Leyland Mini Cooper, one of the things that I found was that if you put a cam in with too long a duration, the engine made less power than it would have done with a shorter cam. And it did so with duration figures that were a lot less than with other engines, like same displacement 4-cylinder Ford. And so I thought, I wonder if we've got a situation where we've got reverse flow. And that's due to the fact that with a Siamese port engine, that is 2 cylinders feeding from one port, as per the Mini Cooper thing, you have robbing. The second cylinder to draw robs the first one. So this only seems to happen to any measurable degree when you're just dynoing. When the duration exceeds about 285 degrees of seat duration, that's actual opening of the valve. Well, I did some flow testing with valves like this. I've got a little story to tell you about that. Grumpy Jenkins put me onto this, but from the opposite end. About 1971, maybe 1970, don't know. I had the good luck to have lunch with Grumpy, and he told me about anti-reversionary exhaust valves, which had a lip on the back side of the valve, and they flowed worse going out than they did in. And I thought, well, that's good. That's got to be worth something. I'll investigate this anti-reversion. And I got back, did this on the intake valve, right? Had the flow bench there, just machined up a valve, and sure enough, you get the sharp edge there, not too sharp, about 5/1000ths edge. And it didn't flow as well backwards. Dyno tested it. It made a very measurable difference down at low RPM. I mean, I'm talking the torque went up by, better than 10% at low speed. And the engine came on the cams much sooner. I mean, as much as 500 RPM sooner. Then it was the same all the way through the mid-range. And when it got to the top end, I noticed that it made more horsepower again. And I thought, wait a minute, the port velocities are so high up there, there should be no reversion. And that brings me to another point. And I'm going to deal with this in another video. Those steep angle valve seats, like we see on Pro Stock Cup cars, etc., 55 degrees, 50 or 55 instead of the typical 45, might not be working due to any flow figure gains due to their shape. They may be sealing the valve better. At high RPM, the valve might not have time to properly seat. But those 55 degree seats, they have a lot less opportunity to leak. Now, doing this here did one thing. It made the seat more flexible. So that even if it didn't seat properly, due to it being precisely slamming down on the seat, but was offset slightly, the seat would flex, thus seal up. Now, that's a point we need to investigate on another deal though. So, doing that was the first step towards anti-reversion, other than getting the port size right, that is. Now let's move on. What else can we do to cut reversion? Well, that brings me to my next area of investigation here. So let's go and take a look at that. The first thing we need to understand here is that the velocity coming out of the exhaust port at the header / manifold face is not uniform. Air has mass. It's heavier than you think. Go and look through some of the 5 golden rules of porting and you'll realize that air is heavy. We don't feel that weight because we're in it. It's like fish don't feel the weight of water. But on with the point. The air has got to turn on the long side. It's got no option. It can't pierce through the cast iron or aluminum. But on the short side turn, it can detach from that short side turn very easily, which it does at not very high lift. It's amazing. A regular port detaches flow on that short side turn, intake or exhaust, very early on in the lift range. On the intake, maybe only as much as 200 thousandths before it detaches, and on the exhaust it could be as little as 100 thousandths. Now, what that does is it makes the velocity on the floor of the port, or in that region, much lower, and sometimes even worse than that. Now take a look at this diagram I'm going to show you. What you'll see here is a Dart big block port as cast. Now I use this one because the as cast port is pretty good. It's not phenomenal, but for a cylinder head that's meant to be cost conscious and is in cast iron and is an entry-level deal, it's not too shabby at all. We did some basic porting on this dart head and used it on a motor, and it made some really wild numbers, so long as you used it right cam, right intake, etc. And you know, I think the guy that now owns it called up and said that they just plonked it in, and basically it's a street motor, and they did something like a 9.5 for the quarter mile. Not bad for a street motor on pump gas. Anyway, the diagram shows that we've got flow going in at the bottom of the port. It's going in at about 70 miles an hour, while at the top it's coming out at something like maybe as much as 200. Yeah. What happens with that reversion is that as the exhaust flow slows down due to the piston getting to the bottom of the exhaust stroke, it gets the opportunity to slow down so much that the reversion, which at this lift we've got here, that reversion would go in the port and then about halfway down the port turn around and come out, and the stream is going out. But as the velocity slows down, that reversion gets all the way to the valve and it pushes exhaust back into the cylinder. You don't want that. You want the exhaust to keep on going out. So what do we do to fix that? I'll show you now. In this next drawing, you'll see a side view of a port that is suffering really badly in terms of reversion. This diagram is actually modeled on the dart head that I just showed earlier on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make an effort to minimize the negative effect of that reversion there. And the way to do that is to make sure that we can flow outwards well, but not inwards. So this is what we do to it. We put on an anti-reversion plate like so. Now it shouldn't take too much stretch of the imagination to see what we've achieved here. We've cut down the exit size of the port to just that area that actually flows out. So the outward flow is barely affected. In fact, the way to size something like this would be to put a plate in, as I'm showing here, and then tweak it until you just see a slight drop in flow, and then drop it down just a tad more. That will get you a port which flows just as good outwards as it did before. But if we analyze the discharge coefficient of the port flowing backwards, then once the valve gets off the seat of any substantial amount, the flow backwards is absolutely terrible. So what we've done is we've kind of made a valve which has no moving parts, not 100% efficient, but no moving parts, and serves our purpose. But there is one problem. Putting a plate actually in the port like this is extremely difficult. It would have been better to weld the port up and make one that was the right shape to start with. So instead of putting the plate in the port, let's put it in the header itself. This is the kind of form we are targeting. You'll notice where I've circled it, there will be a high speed area because all the exhaust is going to go through that area. Now, as I said, we lift that anti-reversion dam just enough so that it doesn't quite impede the flow. So, flow going out of the cylinder is unaffected, but anything that wants to flow back, that's usually along the bottom of the pipe, runs into that air dam plate and can't go back further than that, and it can't go in the opening because the flow is too fast there. This effectively stops reversion. I say effectively because the further on down the pipe you are, the less effective it is. But that said, some of the racing superbikes were using header pipes which had a small anti-reversion cone on the end of them. Not very much, but let's talk about cones now. When I was working on the anti-reversion of the entire system from where the air goes in to where it comes out, which I was doing in the UK, the late Jim Fueling was busy working on exhaust systems which had a anti-reversion cone. That is, the exhaust at the manifold face shrunk down in a cone-like fashion, top and bottom. Now, this did work. I got to dyno test this, and I did a story for Popular Hot Rodding, I believe it was. But the principle of doing it with a cone is wrong. There is no anti-reversion where the gases are flowing at high speed, only at low speed. So creating any kind of an air dam at the high speed section is a no-no. Now let's look at a port that really badly needs an anti-reversion system. That is the Datsun port that we're currently working on here in the shop. $10, $38, $90, $95. This needs filling in to about there. So we can kind of counter that with the exhaust manifold. Yeah. Right, what we got to do is make up a plate that goes on here, and we have a vein sticking in there so that the air has to come along here up, so that all of this up here is going at 300. And then when it wants to revert, it can't, because there's that plate. It's like streamlined this way, freaking awful going backwards. That will make a difference everywhere. Now you can simply do that by making up a plate and putting those in, and then the exhaust manifold on it. Now last on the list of what I would like to talk about here is the pressure waves, or the change in the pressure waves due to us putting that anti-reversion plate in the exhaust. I have to admit, this is an area here which I can only hazard some hopefully reasonably informed guesses. It seems that when the exhaust pulse comes out of the reduced area in the exhaust pipe due to the plate being there, that there is really no change of any great consequence in the pressure energy involved. Yes, sure, things have speeded up there and the pressure will have dropped, but immediately it gets into the exhaust, the pressure is mostly recovered. So no big change there. Now, for the negative pressure wave coming back, things are a little more involved. It would appear that the pressure wave, the negative pressure wave, gets stretched slightly. Most of it goes in. I say most of it, I'm guessing about 75% of the energy goes in as a negative pressure wave into the exhaust, and it's extended somewhat. Don't ask me how much by, I'm going to hazard another guess. I would say the pressure wave is probably 10, maybe as much as 20% stretched. So it happens over a slightly longer period, but the amplitude is reduced. However, that's not the issue we have to consider. What we have to consider is, whether we understand it or not, Does it make more power? Well, yes. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a graph which is the average of maybe a dozen engines, because some engines like a big block and small block Chevy respond very well to it because they have a big pressure gradient across, and I think the Ford's pretty much the same. But there's some engines that have no response to this at all, and it should never be used on them. For instance, the pressure gradient across a Cosworth DFV Formula One engine, that's the one they had all the success with back in the 70s and early 80s. You probe those and it's like 300 feet per second at the top and 295 at the bottom. It's pretty much constant right across there. So I think Jim Fueling went to Cosworth with a header system made up with cones in it, and it didn't work. Well, we could have told him it wasn't going to work beforehand because there was nothing to fix. The engine made pretty much the same power before and after. Slightly less, in fact, than it did with the deal there. So an anti-reversion setup is only useful when there's reverse flow to combat. If you've got a Formula One grade port, not much to be had at all. In fact, probably impedes it. Now, there's one last point I haven't mentioned yet. You could say this was extra frosting on the cake. A pretty big amount of extra frosting. You will notice from the power curve of those averaged out engines that the biggest advantage of anti-reversion is that it bumps up low speed torque and it brings the engine on the cam sooner. Now what this means is we can, for the same amount of bottom end torque, we can use a bigger cam, thus getting more mid-range and high-end torque. Now, how much more cam? Depends on how bad the reversion was. Typical engines like small block Chevys and Fords and Chryslers and big block Chevys, you can figure that you can use 8 to 10 degrees more duration to get the same bottom end you had before when there was no anti-reversion exhaust on it. So that's the good news. Now we're talking about the potential of picking up 30 or 40 horsepower. Not a bad deal. Think about that. Anyway, that's my deal on anti-reversion here. And like I said, I'll finish up this with a graph of what a typical power gain looks like. There'll be no scales on it because it starts off with mini stuff and it goes all the way up to big block stuff, and it's more in percentage gains than anything else. Right, so having finished up at that, let me remind you not to forget to subscribe, notify, comment, share, and if you've got any money left over, a super thanks would be very helpful. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you on the next video.